Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Biographer, where curiosity gets cozy and history takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight's gentle journey is all about Isaac Newton, the boy born too soon, on a winter's night, who would grow to weigh the heavens and catch the colours of light in his hands before we unravel the clockwork of his world. I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Perhaps you're listening in the quiet, before dawn, when the stars still hang above, like the questions that kept Newton awake. Or maybe it's the hush of evening, when shadows grow long, just as his thoughts once did. If you find this voyage soothing, intriguing, or just a nice way to unwind after a long day, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like. And maybe subscribe. It helps this little corner of calm reach others who might need a peaceful pause. Now, I do hope this isn't so fascinating that it keeps you awake, but if it does, well, at least you'll have learned something about the gravity of human curiosity before you drift off. So settle in, slow your thoughts, and let's begin, because even the greatest minds start as a whisper in the cradle of time. We begin in Woolsthorpe, a small village in the English countryside in the year 1642. The world was a colder, quieter place. Winter crept into every stone wall, and timber beam fires crackled in hearths. And beyond the glow of candlelight, the land slumbered beneath frost. Isaac Newton entered that world on Christmas Day, tiny, so small that his mother feared he would not survive the night. He was born 3 months after his father died, leaving him a posthumous child of a widowed farmer's household. The baby's breath was thin but steady, as though even in his first hours he clung to life with the same stubbornness that would later drive him to wrestle with the universe's deepest mysteries. His mother Hannah was a young widow, burdened with both grief and responsibility. The Newton farm lay quiet under snow, and the work of tending it fell to the family and neighbours. Isaac was not a robust child, but he survived against the odds, growing in the rhythm of rural life, surrounded by fields that in spring would burst into green and skies that seemed endlessly wide. Perhaps those skies planted the first seeds of wonder in him. When Isaac was just 3 years old, his life changed again. Hannah remarried and moved away to live with her new husband, leaving Isaac in the care of his grandmother. It was a separation that left a deep mark. The boy became quiet, self-contained, and deeply inward. His companions were the farm's animals, the wind in the hedgerows, and the slow procession of seasons across the fields. He learned early to live in his own mind, to build worlds from thought alone. At the village church he heard the slow chiming of bells and saw the high stone arches lifting toward the heavens. It was a place that seemed to hold both silence and infinity. The young boy began to tinker with simple mechanisms, carving wooden toys and small machines. Sometimes he built models of windmills or water wheels, his hands and eyes already trained on how the world's moving parts fit together. School came in time at the King's School in Grantham, where the dusty smell of books and the scratch of quills became part of his days. He lodged with an apothecary's family, where jars of curious powders and herbs lined the shelves. Here was a miniature universe of mixtures and transformations, a quiet echo of the scientific work he would one day perform. It is said he filled his notebooks with sketches and designs, and even constructed sundials to mark the passage of time. Perhaps this was the first moment a young Isaac began to feel that time itself was a thing one could measure, study, and maybe even predict. Life in Woolsthorpe and Grantham was far from the bustling cities, yet in this quiet backwater, the mind of a genius was forming piece by piece, shaped by solitude, sharpened by curiosity, and softened by the gentle persistence of nature's cycles. All of it preparing him for the great unfolding thought that was yet to come. Isaac's earliest years after his mother left were shaped by the quiet rhythm of the farm, yet beneath that calm there was a kind of loneliness that became as much a part of him as the air he breathed. His grandmother cared for him with steady hands, but there was no replacing the presence of a mother. The farmhouse at Woolsthorpe was a sturdy stone building with thick walls that kept out the winter wind, its windows looking out over fields that stretched toward the horizon. Isaac learned the shapes of those fields in every season. Wheat in summer, bare earth in winter. He walked the boundaries often, alone watching clouds drift overhead, their slow movements, a kind of silent clock marking the hours. The chores of the farm became his earliest lessons. He learned to tend animals, to gather eggs, still warm, from the nest, to carry pails of water from the well. He moved through the barns where dust motes swirled in shafts of sunlight drifting down from gaps in the roof. These moments may have seemed small, but they trained his eye to notice the way light moved in space and how particles danced in air. Perhaps without knowing it, he was already watching nature in the same patient way he would one day watch the heavens. Family life was complicated. His stepfather, a minister named Barnabas Smith, had no interest in raising Isaac, and Isaac in turn harbored a resentment toward this unseen figure who had taken his mother away. It's said he rarely spoke of those years, except in notes much later, where he listed grievances against both his mother and stepfather. Yet even in this emotional distance, something useful was growing: a sense of self-reliance, a habit of turning inward to think when the world outside was unkind. As the seasons passed, Isaac's bond with his grandmother deepened. She encouraged his schooling, though formal education was not always certain. For a farmer's child, there were days when he was pulled from lessons to work in the fields. At times he seemed destined for a life of agriculture, yet his mind was restless. His notebooks, even as a boy, were filled with sketches and strange calculations, marks of a curiosity that could not be bound to ploughs or planting. When he was older, his mother returned to Woolsthorpe after her second husband's death, bringing with her 3 younger children. Isaac suddenly found himself an older half-brother to them. The house grew noisier, the quiet corners fewer, yet his role in the household remained unclear. He was neither the favoured eldest son, nor the baby of the family. Rather, he seemed to exist slightly apart, absorbed in his own thoughts. His mother hoped he would take over the farm. She saw practical labour as more valuable than scholarly pursuits, and there was a time when Isaac tried to follow her wishes, but the truth was plain to anyone who watched him. He lacked the temperament for farm work when sent to market. He would sit in the shade with a book rather than tend to sales. He could lose hours building a water clock rather than mending a fence. The turning point came when a relative recognized that Isaac's talents were being wasted here. The slow fields and quiet barns could teach patience, but they could not feed the hunger in his mind. Arrangements were made for him to return to the King's School, this time with a clearer path toward academic study. He left the farm not with sadness, but with a quiet readiness, as though he had been waiting all along for the next stage of his life. The farm at Woolsthorpe would remain part of him, though its orchards and hedgerows and open skies would later become the backdrop to some of his greatest thoughts. And though the boy who left was still shy and solitary, the young man who returned to the classroom carried with him the steady gaze of someone who had already learned how to watch the world closely and let it speak in its own slow language. Returning to the King's School was like stepping into another world for Isaac. The streets of Grantham bustled more than the quiet lanes of Woolsthorpe. Shop signs swung in the breeze, horses clattered on cobblestones, and the air carried the mingled scents of baking bread and ink from the stationer's shop. The school itself was a tall stone building with echoing halls and windows that caught the daylight in long golden stripes inside the classrooms. Wooden benches lined the walls, and boys bent over their lessons by the flicker of oil lamps when winter days grew short. Isaac lodged with the Clark family, who kept an apothecary's shop downstairs. Shelves upon shelves of jars and bottles lined the walls, some filled with powders as white as frost, others with liquids that glimmered like trapped sunsets. There were curious smells, sharp and sweet, mingled with the earthy scent of herbs hanging from the rafters. This strange and fascinating world of mixtures and transformations stirred something deep in him here, was proof that the world could be taken apart, examined and altered by human hands. And understanding schoolwork came easily to him. Though he was not always the most social of students, he spent hours copying notes with careful script memorizing Latin passages and puzzling over mathematics, but he also built models and devices with whatever materials he could find there. Are stories of him crafting a small windmill, powered by a mouse running in a wheel, and kites, fitted with lanterns, to sail over the rooftops at night. These creations were not just amusements, they were small experiments in motion. Light and force, though Isaac likely thought of them simply as ways to explore questions that would not leave his mind. His classmates noticed his unusual focus and sometimes teased him for his quiet ways, yet he seemed indifferent to their games, preferring to slip away to a window seat, or a corner of the yard where he could read, or draw in peace. There is a certain solitude in being far ahead of those around you, in age or size, but in the landscape of thought, and Isaac walked that lonely but fertile path from an early age. In the apothecary's shop, he observed how ingredients changed when ground, mixed, or heated. These transformations fascinated him, perhaps because they hinted at deeper rules hidden in nature. He began keeping small notebooks filled with observations, sketches, and calculations, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in English, but always with the precision of one who wanted to capture not just the what but the why of what he saw. Outside the school walls, Grantham itself offered small wonders. The town market was a place of colours and sounds. Merchants calling out their wares, wheels creaking under carts piled with goods, church bells marking the hours, and on clear nights the stars appeared above the rooftops, like scattered silver dust. Isaac often paused to look upward, tracing patterns between them long before he had the mathematics to explain their motions. It was during these years that his teachers began to notice his unusual ability with mathematics and problem solving. He could not only follow the lessons, but push beyond them, devising his own problems to solve, and methods to try. In this, he was patient, meticulous, and unwilling to accept answers without proof. It was a habit that would define his entire scientific life. Yet, for all his promise, the world beyond Grantham was still a mystery to him. He had never travelled far, and the centres of learning, like Cambridge, seemed distant and almost unreal. Still, the foundations were being laid here in the classrooms and quiet corners of the King's School. The boy from Woolsthorpe was becoming a scholar, and though he could not yet see it, his path was slowly turning toward discoveries that would touch every corner of the known world. Arriving at Trinity College in Cambridge was like stepping through a doorway into an entirely new realm. For Isaac Newton, the journey from the familiar lanes of Grantham to the ancient courtyards of the university felt like crossing a quiet border into a city of ideas. The college buildings stood tall and solemn, their stone faces weathered by centuries' ivy clung to the walls, and the sound of footsteps on cobblestones echoed under vaulted archways. Here the air seemed charged, not just with the damp scent of the river Cam, but with the voices of countless scholars who had passed before him. As a student in the 1660s, Newton entered a world where learning was steeped in tradition. Lectures were delivered in Latin, and much of the curriculum followed the philosophy of Aristotle, though the winds of change were stirring with the ideas of thinkers like Descartes, Galileo, and Kepler, young scholar from Woolsthorpe. It was both a challenge and an invitation to push beyond the accepted wisdom of the day.
Life at Trinity was modest, for undergraduates' meals were taken in the great hall, where long wooden tables ran beneath the watchful gaze of portraits. Candlelight flickered against the high ceilings, and the air carried the scent of roasted meats and ink from hastily finished essays. Newton's own room was simple: a narrow bed, a desk by the window, and shelves for books and papers. In this small space he began to build a private world of study, often working late into the night by the glow of a single candle.
Though funds were scarce, his appetite for books was immense. He borrowed what he could from the college library, devouring works on mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy. Here he first encountered the writings of Euclid and Kepler, and began to grapple with the methods of Galileo. The clarity, precision of mathematics spoke to him in a way no other subject did, offering a language that could capture the motions of planets or the arc of a falling stone with the same elegance. Outside the lecture halls, Cambridge, in those years, was alive with a mixture of tradition and quiet rebellion. Students debated over coffee in small taverns, exchanged pamphlets and ideas in the narrow lanes, and met in hidden corners to discuss the latest experiments. The scientific revolution was still in its early chapters, and there was a sense that the world's knowledge was being rewritten piece by piece. Newton was not the most outgoing of students, preferring the company of his thoughts to large gatherings. Yet he did not live entirely apart from the currents around him. He attended lectures by Isaac Barrow, a brilliant mathematician whose approach to geometry and calculus would leave a deep impression on him. Under Barrow's guidance, Newton began to shape the mathematical tools that would later define his work. There were distractions too. The life of a scholar was not free from the world's small challenges. Heating a room in winter was costly and difficult. The river flooded in heavy rains, and illness often swept through the colleges. Yet these inconveniences seemed only to drive him deeper into study, perhaps because his mind found in mathematics and natural philosophy a place untouched by the unpredictability of daily life.
In quiet moments, he would walk along the river, or through the gardens of the college, the soft murmur of water and the rustle of leaves offering a counterpoint to the precision of numbers and proofs. Sometimes he paused to watch the play of light through leaves, or the ripples spreading from a tossed pebble. Simple patterns that hinted at deeper laws. This blend of observation and calculation was becoming his way of seeing the world, a habit that would guide him through the discoveries still to come.
In the year 1665, the city of London fell under the shadow of the Great Plague, an invisible enemy that crept through streets and alleys, carried by air and touch it, spread fear as swiftly as it spread sickness, reaching towns and villages far beyond the city walls. Cambridge was not spared from the anxiety, though. The worst of the outbreak remained to the south. The university closed its doors as a precaution, sending students and tutors away to wait out the danger. For Isaac Newton, this meant leaving behind the quiet intensity of his room at Trinity and returning once more to the farm at Woolsthorpe. The journey home must have felt both familiar and strange, familiar in the sights of hedgerows and fields stretching under summer skies, strange in the knowledge that he was not simply going back to childhood, but into an enforced solitude during uncertain times. Back at the family estate, the rhythms of rural life continued with the turning of the seasons, yet the outside world felt distant and muted. The threat of plague lingered like a low cloud, even in places untouched by it. For Newton, this was not a time of idleness. Instead, Woolsthorpe became a kind of private laboratory, a place where the pace of life slowed enough for thoughts to deepen and experiments to take shape. It was here that he began to work in earnest on questions that had been forming during his studies in Cambridge, away from the distractions of lectures and examinations. He turned his full attention to mathematics, refining early methods that would later grow into the foundations of calculus, studied the behavior of light passing through glass prisms, scattering into vivid bands of color. He observed the arc of projectiles and imagined the forces that might guide both a falling apple and the moon in its path around the earth. The orchard near the house was a place of quiet observation, its trees offering both shade and inspiration. Whether or not the famous apple truly fell before his eyes in that season, the truth is that his mind was already turning over the idea of a universal force, one that reached from the ground beneath his feet to the heavens overhead.
In those long months he kept meticulous notes, sketches of experiments, calculations written in neat columns, diagrams of light paths through prisms, and circles tracing planetary orbits. The farmhouse rooms were lit at night by the steady glow of candles, and in the stillness he could hear the ticking of a small clock, or the distant call of an owl beyond the windows. These sounds became the backdrop to some of the most fertile thinking of his life. The absence of formal instruction might have been a loss for another student, but for Newton, it was liberation. He no longer needed to follow the set path of a curriculum. Instead, he could let questions lead him wherever they wished. One problem spilled into another, the shape of a curve leading to the fall of a body, the motion of a body leading to the pull of a planet. By the time the plague had receded and the university reopened in 1667, he returned to Cambridge with notebooks full of ideas and results, work that would quietly seed the discoveries for which he would one day be known. These plague years, though marked by fear for the world at large, became for Newton a kind of golden retreat, a season in which the world stood still, and he learned to see its hidden clockwork more clearly than ever before. The months following Newton's return to Cambridge were unlike any other in his life. Ideas that had begun in the quiet fields of Woolsthorpe now deepened and intertwined into what history would later call his annus mirabilis, his year of wonders, though in truth the work stretched beyond a single calendar year. It was a season of unbroken thought, where gravity, optics, and the strange new mathematics we now call calculus began to take clear shape in his mind. He had been turning over the problem of motion ever since those orchard days, the question of why an apple falls and why the moon stays aloft in its path around the earth seemed at first like separate mysteries. Yet the more he thought, the more he saw they might be one and the same if the same force that pulled the apple downward also reached to guide the moon. Then perhaps that force reached even further, binding the planets in their orbits. He began to test this idea with calculations, measuring the curve of the Earth and the time it would take an object to fall from the height of the moon. Early numbers did not match perfectly, but the seed of the law of universal gravitation had been planted. At the same time light held his fascination in a small darkened room, he arranged a narrow beam of sunlight to pass through a glass prism, watching it fan out into a rainbow of colors, red to violet, each distinct and yet together, making the whole. He repeated the experiment with care, proving to himself that color was not a property added to light by the glass, but an intrinsic part of light itself. These early optical studies challenged long-held beliefs and would later grow into his celebrated theory of light and color. And then there was mathematics. During his time away from formal lectures, he had quietly been developing methods to describe motion change and growth, with a new kind of precision building upon the work of earlier mathematicians. He created a system of fluxions, as he called them, tools for describing quantities that changed over time. It would be many years before these ideas were fully published,
and even more before they became known by the name calculus. But here in the quiet corners of his study, they were already solving problems no other method could touch. What is striking about this period is not only the range of his pursuits, but the way each informed the others. His mathematics gave him the language to describe motion and force. His experiments with light sharpened his skill at precise measurement, and his study of the heavens pushed him to seek patterns that united phenomena as different as an orbiting moon and a falling stone in his mind. There was no separation between these questions. They were all threads in a single tapestry. The pace of his work was steady and unhurried, yet his notebooks filled with results that would later shake the foundations of science outside his small circle. Few knew what he was doing. There were no grand announcements, no lectures proclaiming breakthroughs. Instead, there was the quiet scratch of a pen, the turning of a prism in sunlight, the slow working of thought upon thought. Years later, when these discoveries became public, people would marvel at how much had been achieved in so little time. Yet for Newton, it was less a burst of inspiration than a sustained listening to the laws of nature, as if they were already there waiting for someone patient enough to hear them. Clearly, of all the images tied to Isaac Newton's name, none is more enduring than that of the falling apple, a simple fruit dropping from a branch, sparking a revelation that would change our understanding of the universe. The story has been told in countless classrooms, drawn in children's books, and passed from generation to generation. Yet, like many legends, its truth lies somewhere between fact and embellishment. The earliest account of the apple comes not from Newton's own pen, but from friends and acquaintances who heard him speak of it in later years. William Stukeley, one of his early biographers, recalled a spring afternoon in Woolsthorpe, when Newton described sitting in the orchard watching apples fall, spoke of wondering why they always fell straight down toward the center of the earth, never sideways, never upward. This thought, he said, led him to imagine that the same force might reach upward to hold the moon in its path, and bind the planets to the sun. Whether or not a particular apple actually struck him is doubtful. The image of a fruit bouncing off his head seems to have been a later invention, perhaps added for humor or to make the story more memorable. What is certain is that the orchard was a place where his mind roamed freely, linking the motions of the everyday with the motions of the heavens. In this sense, the apple is less a cause of the idea and more a symbol of the moment when observation met imagination. There is something fitting in the way the story has grown, for it captures the essence of Newton's genius, not in grand experiments or rarefied mathematics, but in the simple act of noticing the ordinary and asking questions so deep that they reach the stars. It is a reminder that great discoveries often begin not with complex instruments but with a quiet moment of attention. Over the years, the apple tree itself became a kind of relic, tended carefully in Woolsthorpe. Even after storms and centuries took their toll, branches were grafted onto new trunks and cuttings, sent to other parts of the world as living connections to the birth of an idea. In Cambridge and London, visitors would speak of the tree with a kind of reverence, as though standing before a monument. The power of the apple story lies also in its humanity. It makes the vast abstraction of universal gravitation feel tangible. Here is a man sitting in a garden, seeing something we have all seen, and yet looking at it in a way no one had before. The difference was not in the apple, but in the mind that received its fall, as a question to be answered rather than a fact to be accepted. Even if the truth is that there was no single apple, no sudden flash of insight on one particular afternoon, the orchard years were undeniably a turning point. For Newton, they were the time when the threads of his thought began to weave together, when the motions of light and bodies and numbers started to reveal themselves as parts of the same great pattern. The apple may be a story, but the wonder it represents is real. And so the legend endures. A quiet scene beneath an English sky. An apple falls, and the world tilts ever so slightly toward understanding it. Is a tale that has outlived its teller, not because it is perfectly true, but because it reminds us that the universe sometimes whispers its secrets in the most familiar places. Light had always drawn Newton's attention, the way it warmed a room through a small window or bent through the curve of a glass bottle. Yet it was during his years back in Cambridge that he began to explore it with deliberate care. The tool that would open this world to him was small and unassuming glass prism, clear and cool to the touch. He began simply letting a narrow beam of sunlight enter a darkened room, through a pinhole, and strike the prism. What emerged on the other side was nothing less than a miniature rainbow bands of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet painted across the far wall, each sharp and distinct in its place. Others before him had seen this effect, but most believed the glass itself somehow coloured the light. Newton suspected otherwise. To test his thought, he passed the coloured light through a second prism, expecting, if the common belief were correct, that the colours might change. Yet they did not. The red remained red, the blue remained blue, each hue retaining its character, no matter how the light was bent from this. He concluded that the colours were not created by the prism. They were part of the light, all along hidden until the glass separated them. He went further, blocking all but a single colour from the first prism, and sending it into another. He found that it would not split again into different colours. The pure green stayed green, the pure red stayed red. It was as if each beam carried its own unchangeable identity. Together, these beams formed the white sunlight we see every day. The elegance of the discovery lay in its simplicity. No elaborate instruments, no great expense, just sunlight, a prism, and the patience to ask, what does this mean? He repeated his experiments under different conditions, changing the angle of the light, the size of the opening, the placement of the prism. Each time the result was the same. The spectrum was built into the nature of light itself. This realization challenged the prevailing ideas of his time. Many believed that light was a uniform substance, modified by passing through colored media. But Newton's work showed that white light was in fact a combination, a mingling of many colors, each capable of standing alone. This would become a cornerstone of optics, changing the way scientists understood vision, rainbows, and the very nature of color. And yet, for all its importance, there was nothing hurried or boastful in the way he worked. He kept careful notes, drew diagrams of his setups, and recorded measurements of angles and distances. The scene was quiet, a man in a dim room, sunlight spilling through a narrow slit, the faint smell of heated wax from the candle sealing the window edges outside the world, moved on, unaware that in this still space, centuries of misunderstanding were quietly being undone. It is said that in later years he demonstrated his findings to fellow scholars by projecting a vivid spectrum across a lecture room wall. Letting the colours speak for themselves, the reaction was not always immediate or unanimous, but the clarity of his method left little room for doubt. In time, these prism experiments would inspire others to explore the physics of light, deepening our understanding of waves and particles long after Newton's own era had passed. For him, though, the work was less about spectacle than about uncovering nature's hidden structure. A rainbow was not merely beautiful, it was a message written in light, and the prism was the key to reading it. By the mid-1660s, Newton's fascination with light had led him to a practical problem. The telescopes of his day known as refracting telescopes, used glass lenses to bend and focus light. But these lenses often produced a blur of coloured fringes around objects, a flaw called chromatic aberration. Someone who had just shown that white light was made of many colours. The reason for this flaw was clear. The lens bent each colour slightly differently, so the image could never be perfectly sharp. Newton's solution was to avoid lenses altogether. Instead of bending light through glass, he would reflect it with a polished, curved mirror. Mirrors could focus all colours equally without splitting them, and so he began to design what would become the first practical reflecting telescope. Working in his small workshop, he ground and polished a metal mirror by hand, its surface needing to be smooth to a degree almost beyond imagining. He mounted it at the end of a short tube, angled so that it reflected the gathered light to a flat secondary mirror, which then sent the image to an eyepiece. The result was a telescope far shorter than the long, unwieldy refractors of the time, yet capable of producing a clear, bright image without the rainbow blurring of lenses. The first of these instruments was modest in size, barely more than a foot long. But when Newton aimed it at the night sky, he could see the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and the fine details of the moon's surface. With striking clarity, it was as though the heavens had stepped closer, offering their light with less distortion. In 1672, he presented his reflecting telescope to the Royal Society in London. It caused immediate interest, not only because it worked so well, but because it embodied a new way of thinking about instruments, rather than accepting the limits of existing tools. Newton had reimagined the very principle on which they were built. His design would become the foundation for most large astronomical telescopes used today. The process of making it had been as much a test of patience as of skill, the constant polishing, the careful alignment of mirrors, the need to keep surfaces clean and free from tarnish. In a time before precision machinery, each step was done by hand, guided by the craftsman's eye and touch. In this too, Newton showed the blend of theory and practice that marked his best work. He understood the problem mathematically, but also solved it physically, building with his own hands the means to see further than anyone before him. The telescope was not only a scientific triumph, but also a personal statement. It demonstrated that his optical theories were not just abstract ideas, but tools that could improve human vision of the universe. The quiet man from Woolsthorpe had given the world a way to look deeper into the night sky, and in doing so had drawn a direct line between his study of prisms in a darkened room and the glittering vault of stars above. In later years, larger and more refined versions of the reflecting telescope would be built by others, but the essential design remained Newton's, a reminder that sometimes the path to discovery lies not in chasing new wonders, but in removing the obstacles that blur the wonders already before us. In the early months of 1672, Isaac Newton's work stepped quietly, yet decisively, onto a larger stage, the Royal Society of London, a gathering place for the leading scientific minds of the time, had taken interest in his reflecting telescope and invited him to present it. The Society's meetings were held in a modest hall where members shared experiments, discussed new findings, and sometimes argued fiercely over interpretations. When Newton's small telescope was demonstrated, its clarity and compactness impressed even the most skeptical observers. It was a tangible proof of his skill, not only as a thinker, but as a maker of instruments. This success quickly led to his formal election as a Fellow of the Royal Society, a mark of recognition that placed him among the foremost natural philosophers of the age. Membership brought with it both opportunity and challenge. The Society was a lively forum where ideas could spread quickly, but also where criticism could be sharp and public. Soon after joining, Newton submitted a paper on his experiments with light and colour, detailing the prism studies that had led him to conclude that white light was a mixture of colours. This paper was read before the Society and sent to members across England and beyond. The reaction was mixed. Some were intrigued, others resistant to the idea that light itself contained colours rather than being altered by the prism. Robert Hooke, a prominent member and an accomplished experimenter in his own right, was openly critical, suggesting that Newton's conclusions were too sweeping. This was Newton's first real taste of public scientific debate, and it unsettled him. His nature was private and meticulous, not given to quick exchanges or rhetorical sparring. Yet, even in the face of criticism, his reputation began to grow. Scholars and instrument makers recognized the originality of his approach and the depth of his reasoning. His telescope was proof that his theories had practical value, and his careful descriptions of experiments set a standard of clarity and precision in reporting results. The Royal Society itself was a reflection of the changing world of science in the late 17th century. It was no longer enough to reason about nature. One had to show it through experiment, demonstration, and proof. In this environment, Newton's combination of theory and hands-on skill set him apart. He could imagine the principles and then craft the tools to test them. Life in Cambridge continued much as before: lectures, studies, and late nights of calculation. But now letters arrived from London, from France, from Holland, carrying questions and requests for clarification. His world was widening. Connections were forming between the quiet rooms of Trinity College, the bustling network of thinkers who were slowly reshaping humanity's understanding of nature. This period also marked the beginning of a shift in his focus. While optics remained a central interest, the larger question of motion and gravity was never far from his mind. The conversations at the Royal Society, the exchanges of letters, and the reports of astronomical observations all fed into the growing web of thought. He was weaving a web that, in time, would stretch from the surface of the Earth to the farthest planets. Newton may not have sought fame, but with his entry into the Royal Society and the reception of his work, it had begun to find him. His name was now spoken in the same breath as those of Hooke-Halley and Huygens, and the seeds were being sown for discoveries that would soon make his reputation unshakable. As Newton's reputation grew, so too did the circle of those who admired his work, and those who challenged it in the Royal Society. Robert Hooke was both a respected experimenter and a sharp critic, quick to question the claims of others. Hooke's dispute with Newton began over the nature of light, insisted that light behaved as a wave, while Newton argued for its particle-like qualities. Their exchanges in letters and public meetings grew tense. Hooke's manner was direct, sometimes biting, and Newton's was reserved but deeply sensitive to criticism. The tension over optics was only the beginning. In the years that followed, another and far greater rivalry emerged with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a brilliant German mathematician. Leibniz had developed his own system of calculus, publishing it before Newton's work on fluxions appeared. Though Newton had been working on the method for years, accusations soon arose over who had been the true originator of this powerful new branch of mathematics. At first, the dispute was carried on indirectly through supporters. On both sides, letters circulated among mathematicians in England and on the continent, each seeking to defend the priority of their champion in time. The argument became public and bitter. The Royal Society itself issued a report supporting Newton's claim, though history would later recognize that both men had developed calculus independently and in different notations. These rivalries left their mark on Newton. He was not by nature eager for confrontation, yet when pressed, he could be unyielding, meticulous in defending his ideas, and relentless in gathering evidence to support his position. He kept careful records of dates, letters, and drafts, so that no one could challenge the timeline of his discoveries. This caution sometimes shaded into suspicion. He preferred to share his work only when he felt it was fully unassailable. The disputes also revealed the shifting nature of science. In the 17th century, it was becoming an enterprise of public priority claims, where recognition mattered as much as truth and the printed word could cement a reputation or undermine it. In an age without instant communication, could pass between a challenge and a reply, yet the stakes felt immediate for those involved. Still, even amid these conflicts, Newton continued to work. The disputes might slow his publications, but they did not stop his private investigations. The same precision and persistence that served him in his research guided him through the maze of argument and counter-argument. He knew that the worth of an idea lay in its ability to explain the world, and in time the strength of his theories would speak more loudly than any quarrel. These rivalries humanized the figure who is often remembered only as a solitary genius. They showed that he was part of a living community of thinkers, one where egos clashed as much as ideas, and where the path to understanding was sometimes littered with personal grudges. The debates with Hooke and Leibniz would echo through the years, shaping how Newton approached the sharing of his work and reinforcing his instinct to guard his thoughts until they were ready to stand alone. In the mid-1680s, Newton's thoughts on motion and gravity, which had been taking shape for nearly 2 decades, began to draw the interest of Edmund Halley, the astronomer, who would later lend his name to the famous comet Halley, visited Newton in Cambridge to discuss a question that was stirring debate. Among scholars, what kind of force could hold the planets in their orbits around the Sun? Newton answered without hesitation, describing the precise mathematical relationship, a force inversely proportional to the square of the distance. He explained that he had worked it out years earlier, but had not published. Halley urged him to put the ideas into a complete treatise, offering not only encouragement, but also practical support to see it into print. What followed was one of the most concentrated bursts of intellectual work in history. Over the course of about 18 months, Newton produced a 3-volume masterpiece, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia, Mathematica, or simply the Principia, written in the formal and precise Latin of scholarly works. The book laid out his 3 laws of motion and the universal law of gravitation. Together these formed a framework that could explain not just the fall of an apple or the orbit of the moon, but the motion of every object in the universe. The Principia was dense, not meant for casual reading, but for those who could follow the chain of reasoning through its geometric proofs and meticulous calculations. Yet even at a glance, its scope was astonishing. Here was a vision of the cosmos bound together by the same rules, from the smallest stone to the largest planet, an ordered and knowable creation. Halley oversaw the publication in 1687, even covering the costs himself when the Royal Society's funds proved insufficient. The printing was done in small batches, each copy carefully set by hand in type, the diagrams etched with fine lines to match Newton's originals. It was a book intended for a small audience, yet its influence began to spread almost immediately among the scientific circles of Europe. Reactions ranged from admiration to awe. Some praised the elegance of the mathematics. Others marveled at the way the laws could predict the return of comets, the tides of the seas, and the flattening of the earth. At the poles, the Principia became a touchstone for the emerging scientific revolution, providing a language and method for those who sought to understand the natural world through measurement and calculation. For Newton, the publication was both a triumph and a relief. It had taken years of private thought and transformed them into a public work, capable of standing on its own. Yet, true to his nature, he did not seek to bask in praise. He returned to his studies, often declining the invitations and honors that came his way. His satisfaction lay in the knowledge that the truths he had glimpsed were now written plainly for others to see and test. The Principia would endure for centuries, shaping the course of physics and astronomy, and becoming one of the most influential books ever printed. It marked the moment when Newton's private vision of the universe became the common inheritance of all who sought to explore it, a quiet proof that ideas born in solitude can reach across time to touch the whole world. Newton's three laws of motion emerged from the pages of the Principia like the quiet bones of a universal machine. They were written in the precise Latin of scholars, yet their truth extended into every corner of daily life. The first law, sometimes called the law of inertia, states that an object at rest will remain at rest, and an object in motion will remain in motion, unless acted upon by an outside force. In the stillness of a resting apple, or the steady glide of a boat across calm water, the same principle was at work. The second law put into words and numbers the relationship between force, mass, and acceleration. It told the world that the harder you push, the more something will move, and that heavier things need more push to move at all. Whether it was the toss of a stone or the pull of a horse-drawn cart, the rule was the same, a simple truth that bound the smallest grain of sand to the largest planet. The third law, perhaps the most memorable of all, declared that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. The ground pushes back against your feet. As you walk, the oar pushes the water as the water pushes the boat forward. Even a bird in flight owes its motion to this balance, pressing air downward as the air lifts the bird upward. These pairs of forces are everywhere, often unseen, yet always present. In Newton's time, these laws were more than clever observations. They were a framework for prediction, a way to calculate what would happen before it happened. Engineers could design bridges to bear weight. Sailors could chart safer courses. Astronomers could predict eclipses and the return of comets. World was becoming a place where cause and effect could be traced in numbers and proven in reality. And yet the beauty of the laws lay also in their simplicity. They were not cloistered away in observatories or locked in the pages of learned books. They could be seen in the bounce of a ball, the swing of a pendulum, the recoil of a musket. After firing in this sense, Newton had taken the language of the heavens and shown that it was the same language that governed the earth beneath our feet. For those who first learned them, the laws were like finding the key to a code that had always been in plain sight. They turned curiosity into calculation, and calculation into understanding. The farmers in Woolsthorpe may not have thought in terms of mass and acceleration, but they knew by instinct that a heavier cart took more effort to start, and once moving, more effort to stop. Newton's gift was to take that instinct and show it was part of a universal order. Centuries later, his laws would still form the foundation for most of the physics taught in classrooms. They would guide the path of spacecraft through the void and help design the machines of industry. Yet they would also remain visible in the smallest of human motions, reminding us that the rules written into the fabric of the cosmos are the same ones that let us lift a cup of tea or step across a threshold. In giving the world his three laws of motion, Newton offered a bridge between the abstract and the familiar, a way to see that the same forces shaping the arc of the moon's path also guide the fall of an autumn leaf, and in that bridge he gave humanity not just knowledge, but a deeper sense belonging within the universe. Gravity to Newton was not merely a word for things that fall, it was the invisible thread holding the entire cosmos together. Picture the moon forever circling the earth, as if tied to it by an unseen cord. Not a rope you could cut, or a chain you could break, but a force that reached through empty space, binding them with a steady pull. the same pull reached further to keep the planets in their great arcs around the sun, and further still to shape the dance of stars and galaxies, though Newton never saw those distant systems. His law reached to them all the same. He imagined gravity as universal, because no matter where he looked, the same pattern appeared in apple drops to the ground, because the earth pulls it just as the earth and moon pull on each other. The pull weakens with distance, yet never disappears entirely in his mind. Space was not a void without influence, but a stage where every actor felt the presence of every other, even across unimaginable distances. To explain it to others, he sometimes asked them to imagine a mountain so high that from its peak a cannon could be fired straight out into the horizon. If the shot was slow, the ball would fall back to the ground as usual. If faster, it would travel further before curving downward faster still, and the curve of its path would match the curve of the earth so perfectly that it would circle forever. This, he said, was what the moon was doing endlessly, falling toward the earth, but moving fast enough that it never hit, always missing the ground, as the ground curved away beneath it. This image captured the essence of his idea that falling was not limited to apples or stones. It was the same motion writ large across the heavens. The difference was only in speed, distance, and the vast scale of space. The same numbers that could predict when an arrow would strike a target could also describe when a comet would return from the dark edges of the solar system. Newton's universal law of gravitation was simple to write yet powerful to use. It said that every mass attracts every other mass with a force proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Those words and numbers became a kind of compass for the invisible. They let astronomers explain the tides as the combined pull of moon and sun. They let navigators trust the timing of the stars. They let thinkers believe that the universe was governed by rules that could be known. There was poetry in it too, though. Newton himself was a man of precise logic. His law suggested a deep unity. The same gentle tug that draws a leaf from a branch is kin to the force that holds the planets in their orbits. It made the heavens and the earth part of a single fabric, one where nothing floated entirely free. For centuries after the Principia, the law of universal gravitation stood as a pillar of science, strong enough to guide ships across oceans and predict eclipses years in advance, even as later physics would refine the picture. The beauty of Newton's vision remained the idea that the cosmos is not a chaos of accidents, but a place woven together by a force that is constant, patient, and everywhere at once.
In 1696, Isaac Newton took on a role far removed from the quiet halls of Cambridge. He was appointed Warden of the Royal Mint in London. At first glance, it might have seemed an administrative post, a comfortable appointment for a man of science. Yet the position came at a time when England's coinage was in crisis. Coins were made of silver, and over the years many had been clipped, small shavings taken from their edges by criminals who then melted and sold the precious metal. The clipped coins still passed from hand to hand, but their value was steadily eroding trust in the currency.
Newton approached the task with the same precision he brought to mathematics. He supervised the great recoinage, a massive operation to withdraw old currency and replace it with newly minted coins that had milled edges, making clipping far easier to detect. The work was enormous, involving tons of silver and multiple mints across the country. Yet under his watch, the operation proceeded with remarkable efficiency. But Newton did not stop at reforming the process he pursued. The coin clippers themselves, with relentless determination, though his reputation was built on study and calculation. He proved equally adept at investigation, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building cases. strong enough to secure convictions in the courts. This was not the scholarly image most associated with his name, yet in London's taverns and alleys he became a quiet but formidable presence. As Master of the Mint, a role he assumed in 1699, Newton oversaw the design and production of coins, ensuring their accuracy in weight and metal content. He introduced measures to improve consistency and reduce counterfeiting, and his attention to detail meant that the coins of his era were among the most trusted in Europe. His office in the Tower of London placed him at the centre of both the nation's finances and its security. The work carried a certain gravity, for Newton here was a system that, like the cosmos, depended on balance and order. Without it, trade would falter, and trust between people would weaken. Perhaps he saw in the mint a human-made reflection of the harmony he sought in nature's laws. Every coin had to be exact, every scale precise, every process accountable to a standard. His time at the mint lasted nearly 3 decades longer than his years as an active professor. It was a quieter legacy, but an important one, ensuring that the everyday exchange of coins in markets and shops rested on solid foundations in the lives of merchants, sailors, farmers, and craftsmen. Reforms were felt, even if his name was never spoken. In the end, Newton's work at the mint was another expression of his belief that truth, whether in science or in silver, must be exact and verifiable, just as a planet's orbit could be calculated. A coin's weight could be measured, and if found wanting, corrected by careful hands and unyielding rules. Moving to London in his later years brought Isaac Newton into the heart of England's political and intellectual life. Yet the bustling streets, the crowded coffee houses, and the glitter of court society never quite altered his inward nature. He kept a modest household, often dining simply and spending long hours in private study, even when surrounded by the noise and colour of the city. His role at the mint required regular meetings with officials and merchants, and he carried out these duties with a formality that earned respect. Though he was capable of polite conversation, he was not given to easy familiarity. His manner could seem distant and reserved, especially to those meeting him for the first time. Yet, among trusted friends, he could show flashes of warmth, dry humour, and even quiet storytelling. He did not marry, nor is there evidence of any romantic attachments. His life's attachments were to his work, his books and his instruments. Some evenings he attended gatherings of the Royal Society, or met with other scholars to discuss new discoveries, but more often he preferred the calm of his own rooms, perhaps reviewing correspondence from across Europe, or making small refinements to a line of calculation begun decades earlier. His appearance in these years was dignified, a tall wig powdered in the fashion of the time, fine but simple clothing, and a gaze that observers often described as steady and penetrating portraits from the period show a man of composure and gravity, someone who seemed always to be measuring the world in both the visible and the invisible scales of the mind. Newton was also a collector of knowledge in forms that did not always fit neatly into his public image. Alongside scientific papers, his study contained writings on theology, history, and even alchemy, manuscripts filled with symbols and coded notes, exploring the transformations of substances. Much of this work remained private. He treated it with the same seriousness he gave to his more celebrated studies, seeing in all of it a search for the underlying order of creation. His London life was punctuated by small routines. He would walk certain routes to the mint or the society, stop at favoured shops for books or supplies, and keep a careful ledger of expenses. These habits gave structure to his days and perhaps provided a kind of anchor amid the shifting currents of city life. Visitors sometimes remarked on the contrast between his fame and his personal modesty. He rarely sought public attention, and seemed almost indifferent to honours, though he accepted them with formal gratitude when they came in 1705. He was knighted by Queen Anne, becoming Sir Isaac Newton, yet even this distinction did not alter his daily ways. In the quiet of his London home, the same mind that once traced the paths of planets now balanced the accounts of a mint, oversaw the striking of coins, and answered letters from scholars and statesmen alike. It was a different chapter of his life, but still guided by the same principles, precision, responsibility, and the belief that truth, whether in the stars or in the affairs of men, must be sought with patience and care. Though the world remembers Isaac Newton for his laws of motion and gravity, he devoted as much, if not more, time to the study of scripture theology and the nature of God in his private papers, which remained largely unseen during his lifetime. There are thousands of pages of biblical commentary notes on church history and arguments on the interpretation of prophecy for Newton. The order of the universe was inseparable from its divine origin, and to understand creation fully, one must also seek to understand its creator. His religious views were deeply personal and often unorthodox by the standards of the Church of England. He held anti-Trinitarian beliefs, rejecting the doctrine that God existed as three persons in one. These ideas were considered dangerous in his time, and could have cost him his position. Been widely known, so he kept them carefully private, sharing them only with a trusted few. He believed that the earliest form of Christianity had been corrupted over the centuries, and sought through careful study of ancient texts to recover what he saw as its original purity. Newton approached scripture with the same meticulous method he applied to natural philosophy. He learned Hebrew and Greek to read the Bible in its earliest languages. He pored over the works of early church fathers, compared manuscripts, and calculated biblical chronologies. His notebooks reveal a mind intent on finding hidden patterns, connections between prophetic visions and historical events, much as he found patterns in the motion of the heavens. He wrote extensively on the prophetic books of Daniel and Revelation, convinced that they contained coded messages about the course of history and the eventual fulfillment of divine promises. He sought to place these prophecies on a precise timeline, linking them to known events, and predicting others still to come, though he rarely spoke publicly about these conclusions. He left behind a vast record of his reasoning, detailed with dates, references, and cross-comparisons. To Newton, science and faith were not opposing forces, but two parts of the same search for truth in the harmonious motion of the planets. He saw evidence of a rational creator in the complexity of living things. He saw design that could not be the product of chance. Yet his God was not one who interfered capriciously with nature, but who had established perfect laws from the beginning, laws that allowed the universe to run like a well-crafted clock. While his theological writings were unknown to most in his lifetime, they revealed a man whose intellectual curiosity knew no boundaries, who believed that every truth, whether in scripture or in nature, was a reflection of the same divine order. In this sense, his study of the Bible was not separate from his study of physics, but a parallel path toward the same ultimate understanding. When these writings were rediscovered centuries later, they surprised many who had known only the public image of Newton as the cool and mathematical genius, yet they add a dimension to his character, showing that behind the polished surface of scientific achievement was a man driven by a deep, enduring spiritual quest. A quest that shaped his sense of the universe as both a physical system and a work of divine art. By the early 1700s, Newton stood at the height of his public authority, not only as Master of the Mint, but also as President of the Royal Society, a position he held from 1703 until his death. In this role he guided the Society's meetings, presided over the election of new fellows and oversaw the publication of scientific works. It was a position that allowed him to shape the direction of British science, though it also placed him squarely in the centre of ongoing disputes. His presidency coincided with a time when scientific ideas moved quickly across Europe. Carried by letters, printed papers, and personal visits, yet the speed of communication did not always soften disagreements. Old controversies such as the priority dispute with Leibniz over calculus still cast long shadows in 1712, under Newton's leadership. The Royal Society issued a formal report on the matter, one that strongly favoured his own claim to priority, though the report was officially presented as the Society's collective judgment. Newton's influence on its content was unmistakable. He also became involved in astronomical debates, particularly over the nature of comets, their paths and their origins. For Newton, these were not idle curiosities. The motion of comets provided further tests of his gravitational theory, and he followed observations closely, incorporating them into later editions. Of the Principia he saw in their long elliptical orbits a confirmation that the same laws governed even the most distant wanderers of the solar system. In these later years, Newton's correspondence extended well beyond England to scholars in France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. Some letters carried warm exchanges of ideas, others carried pointed rebuttals. His tone could be formal and even severe when he felt that his work or reputation was being questioned. He remained careful with what he published, preferring to refine a problem fully before allowing it to leave his desk. As president, he encouraged the Society's emphasis on experimental evidence, valuing demonstrations and repeatable results. He presided over sessions where air pumps were tested, lenses compared, and new instruments displayed these gatherings. In Crane Court were a blend of curiosity and formality, place where a craftsman could show a new device to a room that included both aristocrats and working scientists. Though he retained his sharp intellect, age began to slow his physical movements. He suffered from digestive troubles and, at times, from difficulty sleeping, yet he continued to attend meetings and to oversee his various duties. His name carried such weight that the Society's prestige grew simply by association, and young scientists sought his approval as a mark of distinction. These years also brought him honours from abroad, including membership in foreign academies and correspondence with rulers who admired his achievements. Yet in his private rooms, the man remained much the same as in earlier decades. Methodical, cautious, and often absorbed in a single line of thought, hours at a time. His leadership at the Royal Society ensured that the institution remained a cornerstone of scientific life in Britain, and his influence extended across the continent, shaping how science was practiced and shared. In the great debates of his later years, as in his early discoveries, Newton held to the belief that the universe was ordered by laws both elegant and precise, and that it was the task of the human mind to uncover them piece by piece, whether in the arc of a comet or the balance of a coin. Beneath the public image of the measured mathematician and disciplined natural philosopher, there was another Isaac Newton, one who spent long solitary hours over manuscripts filled with strange symbols, cryptic diagrams, and recipes for the transformation of matter. These were his alchemical studies, pursuit that in his time straddled the line between practical chemistry and mystical philosophy. Alchemy had deep roots stretching back through the medieval world into ancient Egypt and Greece. It promised not only the transmutation of base metals into gold, but also the discovery of the philosopher's stone, a substance said to confer perfect health and perhaps even immortality. While many pursued these goals as literal truths, others saw them as allegories for spiritual refinement and the quest for hidden knowledge. Newton's surviving notes reveal that he took alchemy seriously, copying passages from earlier authors, translating obscure Latin treatises, and recording the results of his own experiments. He described the behavior of metals under heat, the colors that bloomed in solutions, and the residues left after distillation. His handwriting is dense and meticulous, the same careful precision found in his scientific work, though here it is applied to processes shrouded in secrecy. He did not publish any of this material during his lifetime. And for good reason. Alchemy carried a certain stigma even in the 17th century, and its association with secrecy and speculation could have undermined his scientific credibility. Yet the scale of his alchemical output is astonishing. Thousands of manuscript pages now survive, suggesting that for long stretches of his life, he devoted more time to this hidden labor than to his public research. What drew him so deeply into it remains a subject of debate. Perhaps it was the experimental challenge, the puzzle of understanding metals and minerals at a fundamental level. Perhaps it was the allure of an ancient tradition that claimed to hold the keys to both nature's deepest structures, divine plan. Whatever his reasons, he clearly saw no hard boundary between alchemy and the natural philosophy he championed at the Royal Society. To him, both were paths toward the same ultimate order. His alchemical investigations often paralleled the chemistry that would later develop in the 18th century. The careful heating and purification of substances, the observation of changes in color, texture, and weight. These were the seeds of modern chemical practice, even if wrapped in the language of symbols and allegory. In this sense, his secret work was not entirely apart from the scientific revolution, but rather a shadowed tributary feeding into it. For Newton, the laboratory, whether lit by a single candle in Cambridge or by daylight in London, was a place where matter could be coaxed into revealing its hidden properties. Metals dissolved and reformed, crystals grew in still solutions, vapors condensed into droplets on cool glass. In these transformations, he seemed to sense echoes of the same laws that moved planets and bent light, an unbroken thread of order running from the heavens to the smallest grain of dust. Though his alchemical pursuits remained largely invisible to his contemporaries, they add another layer to the portrait of the man. They show that his hunger for understanding was not confined to what could be seen and measured in public, but reached also into the hidden corners of tradition where mystery and method were bound together in a long and secretive dance. By the early 18th century, Isaac Newton's name had travelled far beyond England, across Europe, and into the wider world of learning. His Principia and optical studies had been translated, discussed, and debated in academies from Paris to Berlin, in the courts of kings, and in the quiet studies mathematicians. The clarity and predictive power of his laws impressed not only scientists, but also philosophers and political thinkers who saw in them a model for order and reason. In France, members of the Académie des Sciences studied his work alongside that of their own luminaries, like Christian Huygens and René Descartes. While not all accepted his theories immediately, his ideas gained influential supporters, such as Voltaire, who would later popularize them for a broader audience on the continent. The universality of his laws offered a vision of nature as a single coherent system, governed by the same rules from the fall of a pebble to the arc of a planet. His fame was not confined to academic circles. Portraits of Newton began to appear in private collections, and public galleries engravings circulated, showing him in the dignified pose of a statesman or philosopher. His knighthood in 1705 added to this public image, making him one of the few scientists of his era to be honored in such a way. Writers and poets found inspiration in his work. Some celebrated him as a modern Archimedes, one who had revealed the hidden geometry of the cosmos. Others saw in his discoveries a bridge between science and faith, proof that the order of creation could be understood without diminishing its wonder. Language of gravity and motion slipped into political discourse as metaphors for balance and stability in government and society. The practical impact of his work was also becoming visible. Navigators used calculations derived from his laws to chart safer courses across oceans. Engineers applied his principles in designing structures and machinery. Astronomers refined their observations using his gravitational theory to predict ellipses and planetary alignments. Decades in advance, the accuracy of these predictions gave people a new confidence in the power of human reason to grasp the workings of the world. Correspondence poured in from across Europe, letters from scholars seeking clarification from admirers, sending praise, and from challengers, raising objections. He responded selectively, focusing on those exchanges that promised to sharpen the understanding of a problem. His ability to maintain this web of communication while fulfilling his duties at the Mint and the Royal Society speaks to the disciplined organization of his life. Even as he became a figure of international stature, Newton retained his preference for measured presentation over dramatic display. He did not travel widely to promote his work, nor seek public lectures abroad. Yet his influence grew steadily, carried by the strength of his ideas and the respect they commanded among those capable of grasping them. By the time he entered his final decades, he had become more than a scientist. He was a symbol of the age's belief in reason, precision, and the discoverability of truth. His work was cited not only in scientific treatises, but in philosophical arguments about human nature and society. In this sense, his cultural impact was as profound as his scientific one, weaving his name into the intellectual fabric of the 18th century. The seas of the 17th and 18th centuries were highways of commerce and exploration, but also vast and perilous spaces, where a small navigational error could mean disaster. For centuries, sailors had relied on charts, the stars, and experience to guide them. Yet, the precision of these methods was limited. The appearance of Newton's laws offered a way to bring mathematical certainty to the art of navigation. His law of universal gravitation and the three laws of motion gave astronomers the means to calculate the orbits of celestial bodies with unprecedented accuracy. This, in turn, allowed navigators to predict the positions of the moon, planets, and certain bright stars at any given time by comparing these predictions with actual observations at sea. They could determine their position with greater confidence than ever before. One of the great challenges for navigation was finding longitude, the east-west position on the globe. Newton served on a government commission investigating possible solutions, though he recognized that accurate timekeeping would eventually be the key. His gravitational theory provided astronomical calculations necessary for methods based on lunar distances in which the angle between the moon and another celestial body was measured and compared with tables derived from his equations. His influence extended into the design of instruments too. Telescopes and sextants benefited from the optical principles he had established, improving the clarity and precision of measurements taken on land and at sea. Observatories across Europe used his gravitational calculations to refine their star charts, which in turn were copied into navigational manuals carried on ships bound for every ocean. Astronomy itself was transformed. The motions of planets that had once been described by empirical rules now had a physical explanation. Comets no longer appeared as unpredictable omens, but as bodies moving in calculable paths bound to the sun by the same law that guided the Earth. The return of Halley's comet in 1758, decades after Newton's death, would stand as a public demonstration of his theory's power to foresee events far into the future. The lunar and solar tables, based on Newtonian mechanics, became standard references for astronomers and navigators alike, allowing not only safer voyages, but also the expansion of global trade and exploration. The reach of his ideas extended to colonial outposts, distant ports, and the most remote stretches of the oceans, wherever ships sailed under the guidance of the stars. In this way, Newton's work bridged the worlds of theory and practice. The same equations that explained the motion of Jupiter's moons could guide a merchant vessel through fog across the Channel, or help a fleet avoid unseen reefs. His contribution to navigation was not in the building of ships, drawing of maps, but in providing the unshakable framework within which those ships could move and those maps could be trusted. Astronomy, too, gained a new coherence under his laws. The planets, sun and moons were no longer separate mysteries, but parts of a single cosmic machine. Their motions predictable, their relationships measurable. This unity inspired generations of astronomers to extend his work, refining measurements, discovering new bodies, and pushing the reach of human knowledge further into the night sky. Long before the Principia brought him lasting fame, Newton had been quietly shaping tools in mathematics that would outlive him. By centuries, his method of fluxions, as he called it, was a way to describe and calculate change. It allowed him to determine slopes of curves, areas under them, and rates motion, with a precision far beyond the geometry of the ancients. Though he kept much of this work unpublished for years, it would become one of the twin births of calculus, alongside the work of Leibniz. His approach was rooted in limits, considering what happened as quantities grew infinitely small or large. This let him analyze motion, not as a series of static points, but as a continuous flow, much like water in a stream. The idea seems natural now, but at the time it was revolutionary. It meant that nature's changing patterns could be captured in equations, not only for the arc of a planet, but for the spread of a shadow, the cooling of a metal, or the growth of a plant. Newton's own notation for fluxions differed from the symbols Leibniz introduced, and in the end, it was Leibniz's style that became more widely used across Europe. Yet the underlying concepts were the same. The methods he devised formed the foundation for later developments in mathematical analysis, giving scientists, engineers, and economists alike the means to model complex systems.
In algebra and number theory, he made contributions that are less celebrated, but equally remarkable. He generalized the binomial theorem to include fractional and negative exponents, expanding the reach of algebraic calculation. His work on infinite series provided ways to represent functions as sums of simpler terms, a technique that would become central to analysis in the centuries to follow. He also developed numerical methods for approximating solutions to equations, techniques that remain in use today in computers and engineering design. These methods allowed for practical calculation, when exact solutions were too complex to find, a reminder that his mind was always attuned to both theory and application. Mathematics for Newton was not merely a language for science, but a realm of discovery in its own right. He once wrote that geometry was founded in mechanical practice and perfected by reason, showing his belief that mathematical ideas arose from the tangible world, yet could then be refined into pure thought. The discipline gave him a way to explore patterns and relationships, stripped of any specific physical context. The influence of his mathematical work reached far beyond his lifetime. It became the backbone of mechanics, astronomy, and later physics. The same calculus that guided 18th century artillery would in the 20th century describe the paths of spacecraft and the curves of relativity. His blend of algebraic skill, geometric insight, and practical problem solving shaped the way mathematics is taught and applied, even now. While he guarded his fluxional methods closely for much of his life, perhaps wary of criticism or premature exposure, his eventual publications
ensured that they became part of the shared toolbox of science. His legacy in mathematics is thus not only in the results he obtained, but in the way he expanded the very range of questions that mathematics could answer. By the dawn of the 18th century, Newton's ideas had become woven into the intellectual fabric of Europe. The Principia was more than a scientific text. It was a statement about how knowledge itself could be built. Its combination of careful observation, mathematical reasoning, and experimental proof offered a model for inquiry that resonated far beyond the boundaries of physics and astronomy. In the salons of Paris and the coffee houses of London, philosophers debated what it meant for the universe to be governed by laws of universal gravitation, suggested a cosmos in which order was not imposed moment by moment by divine intervention, but established from the beginning through perfect rules. Thinkers of the Enlightenment saw in this a parallel to their own political and social ideals. The notion that reason and structure could create harmony without constant oversight. Voltaire, after his exile in England, returned to France, carrying Newton's ideas with him, translating and explaining them for readers who might never have opened the Latin text. He presented Newton not only as a scientist, but as a symbol of clarity and rational thought. The Englishman who had uncovered the machinery of the heavens without diminishing their beauty.
In philosophy,
Newton's method became a touchstone for the emerging concept of empiricism, the belief that knowledge should rest on evidence drawn from experience rather than speculation alone. John Locke admired his work as proof that the human mind could indeed unlock nature's secrets when disciplined by observation and logical reasoning. His influence also reached into theology, for some Newton's vision of a lawful universe confirmed the belief in a rational creator who designed nature with precision for others. It opened the door to a more deistic view of God as the architect who set the cosmos in motion and then allowed it to run according to its own principles. These debates shaped not only religious thought, but also the emerging separation between science and theology, as distinct but sometimes complementary pursuits. Scientific societies across Europe adopted practices that mirrored Newton's approach, publishing results with detailed methods, encouraging replication, and grounding conclusions in mathematics. This philosophy of science, structured, careful, and self-correcting, became one of the enduring legacies of his career. It marked a shift from the authority of ancient texts to the authority of demonstrable results. In art and literature too, the Newtonian worldview left its mark. Poets wrote of gravity as if it were a gentle thread weaving together the stars. Painters incorporated telescopes into portraits as symbols of modern learning. Even political thinkers borrowed his imagery to describe the balance of powers in a well-ordered state, comparing the orbits of planets to the stability of a just government. Perhaps the most profound philosophical shift Newton inspired was the sense that the universe was intelligible, that its workings could be understood, not only by a select few, but potentially by anyone willing to learn the methods and follow the reasoning. This democratization of knowledge helped fuel the spread of scientific education and the belief that human progress was not only possible, but inevitable. By the time of his later years, Newton had become more than a man. He was a symbol for the Enlightenment itself, the living proof that careful thought could lift the veil on mysteries that had endured for millennia, and that in doing so, humanity could find both practical power and a deeper sense of place in the cosmos. The image of Isaac Newton that has come down through history is often that of a solitary genius, a man working late into the night in silent rooms guided only by his own thoughts. There is truth in this picture. He was intensely private, cautious about sharing his ideas before they were fully formed. and inclined to withdraw from disputes rather than court public attention, unless compelled, yet the reality is more nuanced. His greatest works did not emerge in complete isolation, but within a network of correspondents, rivals and allies, who helped shape the questions he asked and the answers he refined. Newton's preference for working alone was partly a matter of temperament. He found concentration easier when uninterrupted and valued the freedom to pursue a line of thought without having to explain each step to others. His notebooks reveal long sequences of experiments and calculations carried out over weeks or months, without apparent outside input, yet they also show references to letters received from colleagues and notes from books by other thinkers. The conversation was ongoing, even if not face-to-face. When he did engage directly with others, it was often in writing. His letters were carefully composed, precise and deliberate, sometimes answering a question in full, other times offering only enough to guide the recipient toward the next step. He was not quick to share untested ideas, but when convinced of their strength, he could be a persuasive advocate, especially in the formal settings of the Royal Society. There were times when collaboration played a clear role. The urging of Edmund Halley was essential in bringing the Principia to light, and Newton drew on astronomical data collected by others to confirm his theories. Even his disputes with Hooke and Leibniz, while often contentious, pushed him to clarify and defend his work in ways that strengthened its eventual reception. Still, the balance in his personality leaned toward independence. He was wary of intellectual theft and kept meticulous records to defend his claims. His guarded nature sometimes made him appear aloof or even unfriendly to those who did not know him well. Yet those within his small circle of trust described moments of warmth and quiet generosity. He could offer patient guidance to younger scholars and took genuine interest in promising minds. The solitary aspect of his work style may have been one of the reasons for its depth. He was willing to follow a problem for years without losing focus, to let ideas mature slowly before revealing them in the polished form that became his hallmark in an age when scientific priority could be contested. Fiercely, this caution served him well, even if it sometimes delayed recognition. Whether solitary or collaborative, Newton's method was always deliberate. He sought truth in a way that required both independence of mind and selective exchange with others. The genius was in knowing when to guard a thought and when to let it into the shared light of scholarly discussion. His legacy suggests that both solitude and connection were necessary parts of the process. In the end, perhaps it is less important to label him as one or the other than to see him as a man who navigated the tensions between private insight and public discourse. A man who could spend months alone at a desk, yet also contribute to the collective enterprise of science that would carry his ideas far beyond his own lifetime. Over the centuries, the story of Isaac Newton has gathered a constellation of myths, some charming, others misleading, each shaped by the desire to make a complex life simpler to tell. Perhaps the most famous is the apple tale, which has grown from a quiet moment of contemplation in an orchard into the image of a sudden epiphany, as if gravity had been discovered in a single instant. Rather than through years of study, the truth, as his own accounts suggest, is subtler. The apple was a prompt, not a miracle spark. Another common misunderstanding is the notion that Newton's discoveries emerged in complete isolation. While he was certainly capable of deep solitary work, his ideas formed within the flow of correspondence, debate, and the influence of earlier thinkers. Kepler, Galileo, and Descartes all left marks on his thought. He did not invent science anew, but extended and refined a tradition already in motion. There is also the romantic image of Newton as a figure untouched by the everyday world, a mind dwelling entirely in the realm of pure thought. In reality, he spent decades on practical matters, from coinage reform to administrative duties at the Royal Society, he managed budgets, oversaw staff, and even pursued counterfeiters through London's courts. These tasks were far from the abstract elegance of the Principia, yet they show a man engaged with the realities of his time. Some portrayals soften or omit his more difficult traits, his sensitivity to criticism. His sometimes guarded or combative manner in disputes, while these aspects could create friction, they also played a role in his success, making him cautious about his claims and meticulous in documenting his work. Less careful temperament might have left him vulnerable to the shifting opinions and rivalries of the scientific world. Later generations have also tried to claim him entirely for one side of the science-faith divide, either as a pure rationalist or as a deeply religious thinker. In truth, he was both. His belief in a lawful universe was grounded in his theological convictions, and his study of scripture, much of his time as his experiments. These elements were not in conflict for him, but part of a single pursuit of order and truth. Even his image has been shaped by artistic convention. Portraits often show him in the full wig and formal dress of his later years, projecting dignity and composure. The younger Newton, the restless student, the experimenter in dimly lit rooms, is less often depicted, perhaps because the story of genius is easier to tell in the form of a serene elder than a man pacing alone at night, with candlelight glinting off a prism. The romanticized Newton has his uses, inspiring curiosity and admiration, yet the real man is more instructive because he was not flawless or otherworldly. He was persistent rather than sudden in his insights, cautious rather than reckless in his claims, and deeply human in his blend of brilliance. Reserved to see him clearly is to understand that great achievements can be the product of long patience, as much as of inspiration. The 18th century onward, Isaac Newton's figure began to appear not only in the pages of scientific treatises, but in poems, paintings, and public monuments. Artists and writers found in him a symbol of reasoned discovery and the human capacity to unveil nature's secrets. In portraits, he was often shown with calm composure, seated beside a globe or a prism, objects that spoke silently of his achievements in understanding the earth and the light that fell upon it. William Blake famously cast him in a different light, sketching him as a solitary figure hunched over a scroll of geometric diagrams on the ocean floor. The image was both tribute and critique, for Blake saw Newton's focus on measurement as a narrowing of vision away from the imaginative and spiritual. The tension in that image has echoed through the centuries, reflecting the varied ways people have interpreted his legacy. In literature, he appears in the works of Voltaire as the model of enlightened thinking in Alexander Pope's oft-quoted couplet, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light," a line that captured the sense of intellectual dawn. His work inspired later writers, wove him into historical novels, or used his life as a touchstone for characters wrestling with the relationship between science and faith. Public monuments soon followed. Statues in London and Cambridge depicted him in classical robes, evoking the philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome. Westminster Abbey became his final resting place, and his tomb, a site of national pride. Tourists and scholars alike have stood before it, reflecting on the journey from the quiet fields of Woolsthorpe to the heart of Britain's greatest honours. Popular imagination has kept him alive in more playful ways too. The Apple story, retold in countless schoolbooks and cartoons, distills a lifetime of inquiry into a single memorable moment. His name has been given to schools, streets, spacecraft, and even a measure of gravitational force. The Newton in each case a reminder of how far his influence extends beyond the academy. Artists have also used his image to explore deeper themes about the nature of knowledge. Some depict him bathed in celestial light, as if the universe itself leaned in to whisper its secrets. Others place him in the midst of diagrams, equations, and stars, suggesting that his mind was a space where the boundaries between earth and sky dissolved entirely. Over time, these depictions have merged into a kind of cultural shorthand. Newton as the archetype of the scientist, the patient observer, the man who could see patterns in the tumble of an apple and the orbit of a moon. The real man was more complex of course, but in the realm of art and story he stands as an emblem of curiosity and discovery. In this way, his legacy is not only in equations and laws, but in the images, words, and symbols that keep his story alive. Each new portrayal adds a layer to the shared picture of who he was and what he represents, reminding us that the influence of a mind like his is not confined to the laboratory, the lecture hall, but continues to inspire the imagination itself. In his final years, Isaac Newton gradually stepped back from the demands of public life. Though he retained his titles as Master of the Mint and President of the Royal Society, his duties became lighter and he spent more time at his residence in Kensington. The pace of London life still surrounded him, yet his own days took on a quieter rhythm. Walks in the garden, reading by the window, and receiving a small circle of visitors who came to pay respects or discuss matters of science and state. Physically, he began to feel the wear of age. He suffered from digestive troubles and occasional bouts of gout, yet his mind remained clear and engaged. He kept up with new publications and maintained correspondence with scholars across Europe, sometimes offering encouragement to younger minds, other times debating points of theory with the same precision that had marked his earlier years. Newton was not given to lengthy reminiscence yet. He was aware of the arc of his life and the place his work had come to occupy in the world. He had lived through the Great Plague and the fire of London, through political upheavals and the rise of the Enlightenment. His ideas had crossed borders, languages shaping the thought of nations. Visitors often remarked on the dignity of his presence. By this time, his hair had turned white, and he wore the full formal wig of the period, his posture still upright, his gaze steady portraits. From these years capture a calm that seemed less the product of ease than of long discipline. A man who had measured the heavens and found order there, and perhaps in himself as well. He did not stop working entirely. He continued to revise and prepare new editions of the Principia, incorporating fresh astronomical data and refining his arguments. He also tended to his theological manuscripts, though these remained private. The same patience and care that had marked his early studies stayed with him until the end. Each calculation, each line of script approached with deliberate thought. In moments of leisure, he sometimes hosted friends for dinner or attended gatherings where music and conversation flowed, though he rarely dominated the talk. Those who knew him well could sense when his attention was caught by a subject, his eyes sharpening as if tracing invisible lines through the air. There was no grand farewell in these years, no sudden shift from activity to idleness. Instead, his life eased into a slower pace, the steady current of thought still moving beneath the surface of calm. The world beyond continued to change, ships sailing to new continents, ideas spreading through print, revolutions stirring yet in his garden. In Kensington, the same sunlight and shadow played across the ground as they had in the orchard at Woolsthorpe long ago. For Newton, retirement was not an end to inquiry, but a widening of space around it, time to reflect, to let thoughts settle, and to witness from a place of quiet the reach of the ideas he had set into motion. In early 1727, Isaac Newton's health began to decline more noticeably. The digestive troubles that had troubled him for years grew worse, and he experienced sharp pains that sometimes kept him from his usual walks. Yet he remained in Kensington, attended by servants and visited by friends who found him still clear in mind and composed in manner. As winter turned to spring, his strength failed quietly without great drama. On the night of March 20th, 1727, he passed away in his sleep at the age of 84, a long life by the standards of his time. Word of his death spread quickly through London and beyond. Scholars, officials and ordinary citizens alike paused to reflect on the man whose laws had reached from the fall of an apple to the paths of the planets. Plans were made for a burial befitting his stature. Newton was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, the great church that had become the resting place of kings, poets, and statesmen. The choice signalled his elevation to a figure of national pride, not merely a man of science, but a symbol of England's intellectual achievement. On the day of the funeral, the Abbey's stone walls echoed with the slow tread of mourners. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of candles and flowers. The coffin borne through the nave beneath the soaring arches. The assembled included members of the Royal Society, government officials, and foreign dignitaries, along with a quiet crowd who had come simply to witness the passing of a man whose work had touched their time. His tomb was placed in a prominent position, adorned with a grand monument of white marble figures, carved in relief, symbolizing astronomy, geometry, and other branches of knowledge. A Latin inscription praised his genius and the scope of his discoveries, and above it all, his effigy rested in dignified repose. The face calmed, the posture noble, as if still surveying the world with measured thought. In the days that followed, writers and newspapers reflected on his life. Some emphasized his scientific achievements, others his service to the nation. At the Mint, or his personal integrity, a few sought to capture the breadth of his curiosity, reaching from the mechanics of the heavens to the mystery of Scripture. Westminster Abbey became a place of quiet pilgrimage for those who admired him. Visitors stood before his monument, reading the inscription and feeling the weight of a life that had reshaped the understanding of the cosmos. Generations later, Charles Darwin and other figures of science would be buried nearby, linking their legacies in stone and memory. Newton's passing marked the end of an extraordinary chapter in the history of human thought. Yet the laws he had set down and the methods he had championed continued to work silently in the background of the world. Ships still sailed by the stars, planets still moved in their orbits, and lights still bent through prisms as it always had. The man was gone, but the truths he uncovered endured unchanged. Nearly 3 centuries after his death, Isaac Newton's work still forms part of the foundation on which much of modern science and technology rests. His laws of motion and universal gravitation remain the first language of mechanics, taught to students across the world. From the launch of spacecraft to the design of bridges, engineers and scientists still rely on principles he set down in the 17th century. In space exploration, Newton's equations guide the trajectories of satellites and interplanetary probes. Every course correction, every slingshot maneuver around a planet depends on the precise calculations. His laws allow astronomers use them to predict the orbits of asteroids and to plot the safe arrival of missions to Mars and beyond. Without his mechanics, the modern age of spaceflight would not exist in the form we know. In technology, his influence appears in subtler ways. The optics he explored underpin the design of cameras, microscopes, and telescopes, enabling both the capture of distant galaxies and the study of cells invisible to the naked eye. Fiber optic communication, which carries vast amounts of digital information across oceans, relies on principles of light that trace back to his prism experiments. In everyday life, Newtonian mechanics governs the safety of vehicles, the function of machinery, and the construction of buildings. Even the algorithms that simulate physics in video games begin with his formulas adapted to virtual worlds. His binomial theorem and methods in calculus lie at the heart of computer graphics, engineering models, and economic forecasting. They are threads woven so deeply into the fabric of modern tools that many who use them are unaware of their origin. His approach to scientific method, observation, experimentation, and mathematical description has become a standard not only in physics but across disciplines from chemistry to biology to the social sciences. The insistence on testable predictions and reproducible results is part of the culture of research. Because of the example he set, Newton's reach extends into cultural life as well. His name and image continue to appear in literature, art, and popular media. He has been portrayed in novels and plays, referenced in films and documentaries, and honored in institutions that bear his name. From schools to research institutes, his app remains a universal symbol for the moment of inspiration, even if the real story was more gradual and complex. Modern physics has moved beyond the limits of his theories. Relativity and quantum mechanics describe realms he could not have foreseen. Yet these newer understandings do not erase his work. They rest upon it much as a cathedral rests upon its unseen foundations in the scale of human experience. The throw of a ball to the flight of an aircraft, Newton's laws still describe the world with enduring accuracy. In this way, his influence is not frozen in history, but active in the present. Every rocket launch, every optical experiment, every engineering test that follows the methods he championed is a quiet continuation of the journey he began in Woolsthorpe. His legacy is not only in the ideas themselves, but in the enduring belief they inspire that the universe is knowable and that patient inquiry can reveal its order. In the quiet of Woolsthorpe's fields, the same skies that once stirred a boy's wonder still stretch unbroken above the earth. The orchard, where an apple may or may not have fallen, still grows under the turning of the seasons, its branches bending in the wind as they did centuries ago. If you stand there long enough, you can imagine a young Isaac Newton watching the play of clouds, tracing the arc of the sun, and feeling questions take root. Questions that would one day span from the soil beneath his feet to the farthest reaches of the heavens. His life carried him far from that village. Yet, in many ways, he never left the habit of attention. He learnt there the patience to watch and to measure, the belief that the smallest moment could hold the key to the greatest mystery in London's busy streets. In the candlelit rooms of Cambridge, in vaulted halls of the Royal Society, he kept the same steady gaze turning toward the hidden patterns of the world. We remember him for laws and equations, for the weight of his books and the reach of his theories, but behind those achievements was something simpler and older, a curiosity that refused to rest, the same impulse that drives a child to ask why the stars shine or why the river flows in its course. For Newton, the impulse never faded. It grew with him, expanding into mathematics, optics, astronomy, and beyond, into realms of theology and alchemy, even where certainty could not be reached. His legacy is not just in the answers he found, but in the method he followed, a way of moving through the world with equal parts wonder and discipline, seeking proof, yet never losing sight of beauty. The apple, the prism, the orbit of a comet, each became for him a doorway to something larger, and for us, they remain reminders that the universe still holds questions waiting for a patient mind to explore. Time has carried his name across continents and centuries, yet the essence of what he showed remains close at hand every time a ball arcs through the air, Every time sunlight scatters into color, every time a spacecraft navigates between worlds, we are living in the landscape. His mind helped to chart. He could not have known the full reach of his influence. But perhaps he understood that truth, once found, has a way of traveling far beyond the moment of its discovery. So, as we close this journey through his life, it is worth pausing in that orchard again, hearing the soft rustle of leaves, seeing the tilt of light in the afternoon air, and remembering that even the grandest revelations can begin in quiet places. The thread that runs from Newton's first questions, the tools and knowledge we hold today, is the same thread we each can follow in our own way, curiosity unhurried and unending. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all, that the universe is not only vast, but welcoming to those who seek to understand it, and that in seeking we become part of its story, just as Isaac Newton did long ago.